This stage is for underground artists, entrepreneurs, and game changers. The people you see selling CDs out of their trunks, hawking books on the side of the freeway, sacrificing time away from their kids, dumping their savings in their tanks and hitting the road. It's for the weirdos. Trendsetters, alternative thinkers redefining the field with their alternative mindsets. Mike's Uncut is a movement. It's about passion, sacrifice, believing in yourself when no one else does. Mike's Uncut is for you. We all know who we are. And now, you will too. Welcome, Peoria. I'm Ahava Moray, and this is Mike's Uncut. As usual, we want to thank the Carver Center for their generosity in allowing us to film in their space, which is where season 2 is taking place. If you don't believe in true altruism, then you don't know my next guest. Miss Nancy Frantz is a special education teacher, a longtime member of the church where her husband is the associate pastor, Grace Presbyterian, and also the loving mother of 10 children. She published the book, 10,000 Miles with 10,000 Reasons, which is a memoir of her journey, not only through the process of adopting a child, but also the process of expanding her family, which is a journey that involved 2 continents. Please help me welcome Miss Nancy Frantz. Thank you. So, your book, 10,000 Miles with 10,000 Reasons. To say it's a page turner does not do it service.
Thank you.
No, thank you. I was super captivated in this book and the story. I could not wait to get to the end of it. The book tells about your journey, which started with your desire to adopt one little girl, which led to you adopting a whole village.
Correct.
How did that begin?
Our journey began when we started to sponsor our daughter, and then we found out that she was a double orphan, meaning both parents were deceased. And so when she sent a letter, she was pretty destitute and really needed a home and parents. So we moved in to try to adopt her. The problem is that it wasn't sponsored by an agency, and so it was us trying to recreate the wheel. So we went to Africa to try to adopt her, and along with that, my husband says, if we have all these girls, let's get a boy. And with one boy came 2 boys. They were twins. And so we then went to Africa for the 3 children, but the long line of corruption and bribery.
And you do a very great job of detailing and explaining that in your book of some of the challenges that you went through. You speak about how they refer to it as gifts. The paperwork got delayed, the court dates got delayed, and there was always more money that was demanded.
Correct. We were not anticipating that with all the corruption, but the minute we went into the village to meet the children, the environment was so destitute. There was no running water, no electricity. The children were well underweight, at least 30 pounds with their age. And they lived in just like a little hut with a lot of other people. My boys were uneducated, didn't go to school. They were village wanderers who got into trouble quite a bit. But the minute we went into the hut, we introduced ourselves, then they got into a car with us. They had never been in a moving vehicle before. And so they just went into the car. They only had a uniform on their bodies. They didn't have a favorite blanket or pillow. They didn't have anything to bring. And so then we proceeded to my daughter's hut, and her situation was a little bit better, but no running water or electricity. And I met her ailing grandmother, and her grandmother was so gracious and said, I want her to go to America, even though my daughter cared for her grandmother. And she too went into the car.
All of the families, they knew that an adoption and life in America would yield greater opportunities than they currently had.
It was actually a greater love that they had for their children.
For their children.
Right,
Yeah.
grandchildren. And so we started acclimating them to electricity, running water, how to use a restroom. It was
Simple things, you would think, that
Right.
they just had never done.
Well, they were never exposed to. My boys came from a more primitive environment, so it was a little bit harder for them to adjust. But they liked it, and the most important thing was the nutrition that they were able to have. And they were 38 pounds and 11 years old.
Oh my God.
The weight of a 5-year-old. And so therefore we were trying to build nutrition into their system.
Okay. You did not start out saying, your children, they're from Zambia,
Right, Africa, yes.
And you didn't start out saying, just wake up one day and say, I want to adopt children from Zambia, Africa.
Right.
There was a void that was happening with you at that time.
Right.
What were you experiencing?
My 3 biological children were entering high school and get a little bit older, and I was a teacher, and one day I went to school and there was a child there that needed a home, and I took her home and adopted her. And so we thought, well, this could work, and we just had this feeling like we don't really want empty nest. We really want to nurture and provide for more children. And so it was a long journey. We became foster parents. We had our foster care license, and the journey just got bigger and bigger until we went to Africa.
And how long did that process take from when you first received a letter from Victoria to the end process, which there were so many hurdles? But how long, what duration was that?
It was 3
when
years.
you brought her home?
It was 3 years, yes. Wow. But it did come down to the wire. It was really interesting. Her paperwork expired like December 31st of 2010, and we got her out December 29th, right around there. So it was really amazing journey.
Halfway through the book, I was thinking that it wasn't going to be a great success story.
Right.
There were so many challenges, and I mean, generally speaking, you can pretty much assume some challenges that you might have, cultural, language barriers and differences. But there are some things in here that you touched on that you experienced. You paint a vivid picture that I would never even think that would be an issue. For instance, one of the staff, the social workers that you were working with, you're going to court the 3rd and 4th time and they still don't have this paperwork completed that you've paid a large sum of money for that very purpose.
Right.
And your husband sprinting across town to be able to print this paperwork for the judge.
Right.
The end of that story is that you missed the court date.
Right.
And it had to get pushed back again.
Right. It was hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. And there was many things that we were not informed of that we had to go through the loopholes to get there. Like for instance, we were supposed to have yellow fever forms and a yellow fever shot, and no one informed us from the airlines, and I had to sneak onto a bus to sneak onto a plane.
It's like she's gonna go to jail.
I know, right? And so many hurdles. But our faith really helped us navigate this, knowing that these children were picked by God to come and to live in our family. Gave us hope.
That also brings to mind one of the other challenges you faced, again, with the corruption and the money. You were at the airport. Every time you went to the village, you talked about how even though you were there for your children, you were so immersed and affected by the poverty of the whole village and the other children.
Yes.
So you had suitcases of shoes that you were bringing back. What happened at the airport?
This was very interesting. We had actually packed 350 pair of shoes in 5 large suitcases. So this is a little airport, a little local airport, but the armed guards with AK-47s.
Oh my God.
Yes, and so as they were unzipping the suitcases, I heard all this chatter amongst the soldiers. I'm like, what is going on? You zip all 5. And I thought, I've got to get these shoes to the orphans. They cannot go to school without shoes. Many of them do not have shoes. And so I was rushed into an office by a soldier with an AK-47 and said, you are going to sell these shoes to the black market. And I said, no, this is for the orphans. I had a local pastor with me. He tried to intervene, and she says, you have to pay for those shoes. I said, I already paid $500 to get them to Africa. I said, if I give you the money, it was in my hand. I said, if I give you this money, you're taking food out of the mouths of the orphans. And she said, render to Caesar what is Caesar's.
Oh my God.
Which is a Bible verse. It was Caesar's meaning government. And I said, please. And the pastor actually dropped to his knees and begged her for those shoes. And she says, render. And I said, you're taking the food away from the orphans. And I slapped all the money into her hand.
Was this through translation, or were you speaking English?
I was speaking English. The pastor was translating through me. And so, and I said to her, and render to God what is God's. And these shoes are of God and for the orphans. And so I was kind of roughed up by the soldiers. And so I was escorted out, and I couldn't believe I had no money for any food for 350 children. And a soldier yanked my arm, yanked me back into the office, and she did not, the official did not make eye contact, and she slapped me the money in my hand, and I was able to have a food distribution in the village.
Why do you think she did that?
I was hoping her conscience got to the best of her, and maybe the Lord was watching out for these orphans to provide.
There are so many powerful, thought-provoking instances like that. You talk about how you were just changed, how things that we take for granted here in a first world country, luxuries, materialistic things, electricity, even ice cream. And you question how you've been spending your money and your time once you discovered this calling.
That's right.
How else has your life changed?
Well, in many ways, to broaden my scope worldwide, that there are orphans out there without parents that are really suffering. It has changed my whole outlook on how my finances, my priorities, what's most important in life, and how can I reach the fatherless also. It has changed me considerably.
Did you find that people in your life didn't support your mission, you and your husband?
Yes, we looked foolish in many ways, where our friends were going out to dinner and doing fun things. We're trying to bring more children into our home. The task seemed impossible against all odds. So consequently, some people started to isolate themselves from us and question us. We got quite a bit of criticism, but our goal was to rescue 3 children. It paled in comparison to what they were feeling at the time.
And when you embarked on this journey, you had no knowledge of adopting. What would be a key piece of advice for someone who's thinking about embarking on that journey that you give?
Just to know it takes a long time and a lot of finances and a lot of patience. But once you connect with the child you're going to adopt, there's some type of huge connection there that you will go for that child, be an advocate for that child at all costs. And so just pace yourself. It takes a long time. But there's some wonderful things that happen while we're over there, just to learn their culture. They're very kind people, very patient. And so just to be in Africa, to see where my children grew up from, was really pretty special.
So it sounds like you don't try to shield them from that cultural experience or that knowledge of where they're from.
Oh, not at all. Eventually, my daughter is studying to be a nurse, Victoria, and so she wants to go back to her village to treat the children medically. And so in some way, the children want to give back to the village because they see that need and the difficulty that they're in. But there was just so many instances during that adoption. At the very end of our journey, we went to Africa 3 times, At the very end, we came to a standstill. We needed death certificates of the children's parents. And so they said, go to the chief of the village. I'm like, chief? Who is that? What does this all mean? And he was not accessible. And so the U.S. Embassy was working a little bit along with this, but was contrary to the situation because 3 kids getting out of Africa is red flagged by both countries.
And you mentioned that was because of their age. So they were concerned that this was for sex trafficking.
Exactly.
Okay.
That would be the correlation. And we were confronted with that several times by the U.S. Embassy. So at the last moment, it was on Veterans Day, the embassy was closed. I emailed the official and I said, I'm returning the children to their original state. That's all I said, meaning to go back to the village, because we couldn't obtain the paperwork needed to get the visas to get the children out. And so I closed my laptop. We had our plane tickets purchased, and then I said, we better check one more time. And she had one word, wait. And so we canceled our flight, and she said to me, what do you mean by the original state of the children? I wrote one word, village. And she knew that's the most desperate and dire environment for the children. And so what the U.S. Embassy did, they actually took an entourage of soldiers in a private plane and flew near the village. And I had checkpoints, different pastors, and this whole guard and officials were brought closer to the village by one pastor, closer, because it's a remote village. And they finally found the grandmother and said, are the parents of these twin boys deceased? Grandma said yes. They got out of the village, flew out of the village, back to the U.S. Embassy, and the next day we had the visas.
Now, is that something that an embassy, is that a role that they would play normally?
Never. It was very highly unusual and well beyond. Why they did it, I am not sure, except for she realized that the village would be a death sentence for my children.
I do want to take some time to delve a little more into that, to talk about why the time was so sensitive. Because I don't think people understand, this was even after thousands of dollars spent. You've gone there 3 times. You've left your biological children home. The court date has gotten pushed back. You've been denied. And this was actually occurred after the judge finally approved the adoption. But that wasn't the end.
It was not the end, no, because we needed the visas. Like I said, we had like 1 week left out of the 3 years, 1 week to get the 3 children out of the country. And it would have been all over. They would have just returned to the village.
And how was that conversation? There were some tough conversations you had. Victoria actually got adopted after Andrew and Andre. And then there was a moment where you didn't think you were going to get to bring her home at all.
No, it was a very difficult situation. She started to cry and said, you went to get me first, and now you have the boys. Where do I go? You know, where do I return to? Because there's no orphanages per se where she was from. There was no one to take care of her. It was pretty difficult.
Yes, difficult to say the least.
That's right.
We're going to take a moment, and when we come back, you're going to share with us an excerpt from your book, 10,000 Miles with 10,000 Reasons. Stay tuned. Welcome back, Peoria. You're right on time because Nancy Frantz, author of 10,000 Miles with 10,000 Reasons, was just about to share an excerpt from her book with us.
Thank you. Speaking about the U.S. Embassy flying in, the officials would now have to find an obscure village, a remote hut, and an ailing grandmother in order to gather proper verification. Realizing that the mission was nearly impossible, Carrie, my husband, and I quickly contacted an administrator and pastor to alert them that the U.S. Embassy would be descending on the village. Thankfully, they were able to meet the officials and escort them into the village. What a spectacular sight. The U.S. Embassy was coming to a desolate village and would be confronted with the challenge of trying to dialogue with a non-English speaking grandmother. After the officials arrived at the grandmother's hut, they sat down with the ailing grandmother and a distant uncle in order to verify that the boys were truly orphans. Amazingly, they gathered correct documentation and then flew out of the area to start processing the visas. The very next day, the visas were processed.
Wow.
It was amazing.
Would you say that was the most challenging part of your entire journey?
Probably the court times were, because the judges were so authoritative and difficult to get through.
So one of the other aspects of your book that I love is that you have statistics and different facts about Zambia, like the death rate, a prevalence of HIV and malaria. You talked about how when you were going through the process, you and your husband were staying at the guest house with the kids. Mm-hmm. They were using a toilet for the first time, electricity, they were astounded by it, and you bathed them. And you saw that there was a black slime, you called it, on the bottom of the tub, which you then realized was actually worms.
Right.
That had come off of the children.
Right. There was just thousands of them.
Yeah.
And really worms start to manifest like through the scalp and through their nose and ears, through their mouth. And there was thousands. The problem with worms is if there's no food in the stomach, they start to eat the stomach lining, becomes very painful. I asked the pastor, how many orphans do have worms? He said, all of them.
Yeah.
And so it's a very difficult, all of them have the worms. It's very difficult. Treatment's 50 US cents, 50 cents.
Yeah, they
it's
said
treatment.
that, and 50 cents for the medication, which can be treatable if you do it in time.
Right.
Makes you think about, what's the last thing I spent 50 cents on?
Right, right. It's a very painful thing to have parasites like that.
So you went through this intense, profoundly educational, life-changing journey with your family.
Right.
Now you have all of your children home. You have 10 children.
Yes.
How have you seen them grow?
Oh, it's amazing. They have like doubled in size and tripled in weight, the boys have. Just to acclimate to the schools, they were non-English coming to America to learn English. It's overwhelming, so many things that we have. Just walking into Walmart and all the scents and all the products, it's very difficult for them to take all that in. So it's like a sensory overload initially. Just because there's running water, my boys were fascinated. There were drinking fountains with fresh water. You know, things that we take so much for granted, they're like, wow. When they first came to our house, I thought our garage was the home. And so when I ushered them in, the first thing all 3 children did was open the refrigerator. And all of them said, wow, because they knew that there would be food for them. And so there's just been, it's just a long process, but it's very beautiful in a lot of ways.
Yeah. What is the biggest sacrifice or cultural adjustment that you made once you returned with your children? Because I imagine you had to adapt as well once they were in your home.
That's right. There were many cultural changes. Well, just the climate in itself.
Yeah.
You know, never having mittens and hats and boots on was a huge cultural difference for them. Of course, the language. And children are just unbelievably respectful to adults in Africa, and then just to see the disrespect, they just kind of shunned that because they didn't want that for themselves. There was just vast amount of cultural differences.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you speak about your journey,
Yes.
the process of adoption.
Right.
You've been published in Christian Women's Magazine.
Yes.
What is your ultimate message?
My ultimate message is there are orphans still out there, and all the proceeds from the book go to back into the village.
That's incredible.
Well, I'm very thankful to be able to use it. So we're actually next week having a food distribution in the village, and I have a Zambian man orchestrating it. And so the message would be, think outside the box.
Is it too late to, well, if you can buy the book and the proceeds go towards the village, or can we donate to you?
Yes,
Okay.
and that's through gracepress.org
Okay.
under donate, and it says Zambian funds, and you can donate through that.
How often are the food distributions?
We're having it every 2 months,
Okay.
although we have an ongoing food project, a farming project going on right now. So our ultimate goal is sustaining food for the village,
Yes.
because you can keep donating, but the needs are so great. This way they can take ownership, and that we're giving fertilizer and seed and teaching them how to farm so they have sustainable food.
And that's another thing. You hear the horror stories about how your donations or your money never gets there. Are you working, what is your trusted source in the organizations you work with?
Oh, very trusted, and there's 5 layers of accountability.
Okay.
So it has to go through our church, and then another organization in Zambia, and then another pastor, and then finally the person who's doing the distribution.
Okay.
So there's actually 5 layers. We have to have verification and receipts. It's a very foolproof.
Okay,
Yeah,
wonderful.
and all the funds go directly to the orphan. It doesn't go to the administration. It goes right to the orphans.
Wonderful. There you have it, Peoria. Miss Nancy Frantz, author, mother, and above else, advocate for at-risk populations.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.
I'm Ahava Moray, and this is Mike's Uncut.